So we continue next with Dr. Maryleen Amaizu on building trust and combating misinformation in AI and in crisis, basically. So Maryleen is an AI scientist and an educator. She is passionate about empowering individuals and organizations to thrive in the ever-evolving world of data and AI. As the principal investigator of data study group at the Alan Turing Institute, she collaborates with industry partners to transform commercial ideas into data science research projects. Her talk today is going to explore the complex relationship between trust, fake news, and the role of GenAI in navigating this complex maze. She will delve into the challenges of quantifying specifically trust and its impact on information consumption. Maryleen, we're very happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good morning. Yeah, this is our first time in Lebanon, myself and my husband, and we're really excited to be here. We're so happy. Thank you for inviting us. So my talk today is going to be on building trust and combating misinformation with AI in crisis. You know, as the other speakers have mentioned, particularly Lama and Sybil, Sybil mentioned that trust is very complex, and I agree with that as well. It's very complex to measure and quantify trust. So I'm going to be building on the work we're actually doing with the Alan Turing Institute and Kunato AI, that's a startup in the AI space, to understand trust and the complexities. So one particular experience I had, and I could relate to it as well, during the COVID-19. Actually, the rumors and the misinformation spread in some areas even much more than the virus, because you had some persons who, you know, that talked about it's not real, it's fake, it's man-made, several issues, but particularly about the humanitarian response. Some of the, you know, rumors that were spreading and the misinformation was actually hindering that. So, for example, when people say, okay, this is actually being inflated, the figures are inflated, or the vaccine actually is being used to reduce the population. And these are some of the challenges. I remember my mom, even as a healthcare worker, she would forward some WhatsApp messages to me, and I would always worry about that, how to actually educate her that some of this information is not real. So, and this is something really, really complex in terms of combating it, especially with discerning truth. When we talk about truth and trust, in this time and age of information overload, sometimes within that mixed bag, we really struggle to discern what is true and what is false, what is truth and the fake news. And that is really challenging because you have lots and lots of information and there's a mixed bag. And when we relate that to the crisis, you know, when we have humanitarian crisis, we have that deep root of fear, we have that deep root of anger, anxiety, confusion that's already deeply rooted in persons. And when that branches out to either misinformation or disinformation, you see that above the surface, we can see a lot of effects of, you know, this to the community. You can see violence, you'd see, you know, even the aid efforts being hindered, and we have social division. So that is being stirred up as a result of the effects of misinformation and disinformation. And that is why this is, I feel that everyone in one way or the other, whatever part of the country or the world we are in, I'm coming from the UK, I'm originally from Nigeria, that's my home country. But I know that it is challenging. In one way or the other, it has its effects. I saw cases where, you know, persons who, when the COVID-19 hit, and they said salt water could be used to treat COVID-19, and people actually died because of drinking too much salt water. People died out of, they said, because it's transmitted by mosquito bites, and they were using chloroquine, and people actually died out of that. So we have real dangers of misinformation, and in crisis as well. This is something we want to combat in every possible way. And it's really a vicious cycle because you have, for example, people who already have their existing biases. There is that lack of control. There is that fear. There is a lot that is going on, anger, fear, those emotions. And when you have information that people already, maybe when there's information overload, they tend to look for shortcuts. And in that shortcut, you'd see them tilting towards the same information that sort of strengthens their biases. And that's why it becomes a self-sustaining cycle, a vicious cycle, because there's the people tilt towards information that really ground their own existing biases. And that's why I'll refer to what Lama said during her talk. You can't rely on humans to detect misinformation, because, especially in crisis, because people already have their biases, right, and their fears and those inherent emotions. So actually just relying on them to, okay, just like my mom forwarding some misinformation to me via WhatsApp, we can't really rely on them because at that point, most times the emotions have gotten a better part of persons. And I know that because in this talk as well and in what is going on in the society, we are asking ourselves questions about the role of GenAI. What's the role of GenAI in the spread of misinformation? Would we say it is to blame? Are we blaming GenAI? Are we pointing to AI? I know that GenAI is like a double-edged sword, right? Because on one side, you have actually that it's saving a lot of, it's actually helping people create content and saving time, a lot of time, man hours and productivity being gained by, you see, for example, here, GenAI saved 100K hours in under a year, or it was able to produce 100 blogs in 100 hours. That's saving a lot of time. But also on the other side, you also have some of the dangers, and that might come from either intentional or unintentional generation of this misinformation. So for example, unintentional, the hallucination that comes out of it. And as a matter of fact, when I saw this was really alarming, that AI chatbots got election information wrong 30% of the time. So this was from an experiment that was being done, and you realize that we need to really do something about that as well, to fix that. And some persons, some malicious actors as well, are using GenAI to perpetrate a lot of evil and harm to persons. So, but can we really blame GenAI entirely? Well, it's really complex, but there's an image here. You'd see that the photo here, this was actually a tweet that went viral, fake news that went really viral. And what you see here is that the picture, if you zoom in, if you look at that image very well, is actually a low-quality image, a low-quality photo generated by AI. But yet, the effect it had, how much people believed that and shared that and how much it went viral, actually tells us that it is beyond putting it on AI, because even before AI started getting sophisticated, we had Adobe, Photoshop, some of those tools that were already being used to generate photos that were even much more believable than this. So we would see that it is really deeper than putting it on AI. Yes, AI is going to be playing a lot of parts because more and more you'd see creation of images that are going to be better quality. But let's look back before this AI virality. We would see that there's been a lot in our information system. And that is why I would refer to this quote that one of the most powerful things you can do to identify misinformation, whether it's AI generated or not, is to look at where it's coming from. Like we said, you cannot just put it on. Yes, humans have a part in making sure they verify the information, but sometimes, especially in crisis mode, you might not really rely on that human. And from what we are seeing from research, that it's really becoming difficult to distinguish. Lama, I think you mentioned 36, right? 36%, and that is really alarming. So what we can then begin to look at is to look at how our information system, how we can tackle it from that point, from the point of creating, distributing, curating, using, and archiving this information. So yes, AI may speed up fake news creation, but our information systems inherently feel that misinformation spread, which is what we are, the way we are tackling this is really from that viewpoint of the information system, looking back at the information system, looking back at the source, how the information is being generated, and because if it's not in the hands of the audience that are reading this news, they won't have that tendency to spread it. So that's where we began to tackle this from. Looking at I know trust have been mentioned, trust index. So, and this is not really a new concept, just that trust itself is very, very complex. It's a complex thing, and to actually think of quantifying it, for example, if I say, do you trust someone, let's say your loved one, you can't quantify it. You can't say it's 20%, I trust you 20% or 50%. So actually quantifying trust itself is in itself not very easy to do, but we need to set like a benchmark, for how publishers, for how people who are creating this information should begin to think about their content, to begin to measure themselves in the whole ecosystem. And that is where we're moving towards that AI-driven resilient information ecosystem in crisis. Looking at the players, we have the consumers, we have the publishers, we also have the humanitarian response team that, most times their efforts have been hindered by the spread of misinformation. So, and the first, the basis or the starting point for this is the trust index calculation, how we can calculate the trust index that can be used to evaluate content and can be used to benchmark publishers of this news. So how can, for example, users or consumers make informed decisions about what they consume online? Because we live in a world where even sometimes when you go on Google or LinkedIn or wherever, what you see is because of what the algorithm wants you to see. Right? So you're not really empowered to decide on what you actually want to see. And that is really something that is putting a lot of people off. And that's why we need a way to benchmark publishers so consumers can be empowered. They will be empowered to make decisions, informed decisions about what they consume. And on the other side as well, analyzing the impacts of trust. So what effects, what's the relationship, exploring that relationship between this trust index and let's say other variables like, let's say the traffic, publisher traffic, or the consumer engagement, the audience engagement, and a lot of factors as well, even the revenue, when you bring it down to also revenue as a driver. And that can become a transparency tool for the publisher. So it would be something that would push them to continuously improve. For example, they understanding what factors may be affecting their trust score, and it becomes a driving force for them to improve that score and invariably reduce the amount of fake news that they put out there. So everyone aiming for quality journalism. So that's really going to be a motivator for them and a deterrent from publishing most of the fake news. And then looking at the future here, we want to get to the point where we're able to predict what is going to happen with what we see now in the conversations that are going on, like an empowerment for the humanitarian response team to be able to detect the signs of developing conversations and begin to proactively take actions on them. So that's really the vision. I know for trust, what we're looking at and the data we have so far, it's really complex, right? Because we have to consider several trust drivers, so veracity, commercialism, sentiment. So for example, looking at the user and the audience feedback, objectivity. So that one as well. So what does, and this is where the domain experience comes in as well, to measure how factual their news is, the amount of bias that they have in their news, and the objectivity. And we also have engagement, so how people are engaging with those contents or with the articles. And this, in terms of the approach or methodology, first of all, we start off with the bespoke trust filters, so looking at the whole conversational space, and then the specialized machine learning models, index and scoring. So I'll start off with the bespoke trust filters. So first of all, we have the publisher's news and conversation space. So all the data about the news, all the data about the articles that the publishers themselves are putting out there, as well as the feedback they are getting from the audience. So what the audience, the users, consumers of these articles are saying about them. So that is the whole data space. And so far, there have been some of the publishers have come onto the system, but then it's really like a massive one. The vision is to get as many publishers as possible and to be able to get as much data as possible about those conversations that are going on, so it can guide how we can measure trust. And then coming to specialized machine learning models here, so because a lot of feature engineering has to go into taking that data from that space, into putting it into dimensions, what we call trust dimensions or trust drivers that will really capture the trust-related features. And some of the approaches, for example, there is reinforcement learning with human feedback, CMS networks, and so many methods that we're trying out as well, just to be able to extract those features and put them in a form that can be captured with trust. And the other part is the index and scoring. So how we are weighting the different trust drivers based on veracity, sentiment, and some other approaches of checking the trust dimensions. At the end, we want to get a score, whether that's going to be based on a 0 to 1 or 100%. So for example, let's say ideally a publisher who is at 100% is like, has the highest trust index, for example. But of course, we don't expect to see perfect. Yeah, but that is going to be a benchmark to actually check how their credibility, their reliability, the reliability and credibility of the news source. And this is something we want to check over time as well, because that is also another factor. What's the history of fake news? What's the history of this publisher looking back in time to see how they've been performing in that space? Now, I'm going to show like just a sample of what this data looks like and what the vision we're trying to get at, but this is a work in progress and preliminary, but I'll also share the end, how you can get to see the outputs of the research that we're doing currently. So for example, here, within the overall information ecosystem, we should be able to see with the publication timestamp and the trust score, how it evolves over time, and be able to break that down into the different trust drivers or the trust dimensions. So for example, veracity, sentiment, and engagement. And these are things that are intrinsic features that make up that whole trust domain. And for a particular publisher as well, so a publisher, let's say we have an industry benchmark for what is reliable news or what is reliable content, then that publisher should be able to benchmark themselves and see how they are performing against that benchmark, that industry benchmark. The another thing as well is for the publisher to understand how their trust score is varying over time. And remember, this is supposed to be a tool that can also help publishers improve and deter them from publishing fake news. So that would also help them break down, understand, have that insight into what is actually impacting their trust score, what dimensions of trust, what drivers of trust is actually affecting their trust score, and that can then help them take some actions and to more like proactive actions to improve their score. And where we want to really get to and how that really ties to humanitarian crisis is, the point where we can do some predictive modeling and have an early warning system, because we know that conversations usually emerge in patterns. And what we tend to see is that when that conversation is fully blown, when it's now gone viral, that's when sometimes the humanitarian response are overwhelmed because they're seeing, oh, this is a new thing that has come up. But if we can, with the processing of that conversation using natural language processing techniques and really monitoring that conversation in a timely way, we can see that early enough. So for example, here, rather than waiting till phase 4, when that is now a fully blown viral conversation that has its own consequences and damages in the entire ecosystem, we would be able to detect it on time, and maybe the humanitarian response team would then be able to take proactive measures to, for example, if that might be that they have to prepare ahead and begin to run some campaigns to, let's say, dissuade such, if it's going to be like a societal unrest, they can begin to take some proactive steps and run campaigns or put in some measures in place. So they can tackle that early on, or they can prepare for when it's gone viral. So going back to the example of the COVID-19, if, for example, you know that people are beginning to, there's this pattern about that it's going to be cured with salt water, for example, and you can begin to do something early on to make sure that it doesn't come to that point where everyone in that community believes that, yes, I can now start drinking salt water to cure COVID or to prevent COVID. So this is really what the idea and the essence of doing some predictive modeling on that conversation early on. And I'm going to talk about generative AI. Yes, we mentioned earlier, GenAI can be, on one side an opportunity, as well as, it has its own consequences as well. But knowing the limitations of GenAI as the technology, we're beginning to see as well that, yes, the intrinsic abilities of GenAI, because of the kind of data it's trained on, because of its limitations, and yes, it tends to, we say it has a world knowledge, but what kind of world knowledge? It's limited in its sense. And that is where, if you go outside that circle, the augmented abilities of GenAI comes into play. Like, that's where we begin to talk about retrieval augmentation, use of tools. So anything that is going to ground it in context with additional data. For example, if there's specific context that can help to make sure that you plug that into data that is more current, more recent, that could ensure that whatever it gives out, whatever, because almost everyone today is like a content creator, and everyone is using these tools. But if we can then augment those abilities, then it will begin to have improvements in the output that come out of it. But that's not to say that that is going to be the fix, that it's going to fix all the issues with GenAI, but that can be a step to actually reduce that impact of producing misinformation from GenAI. So finally, for me, I believe that each of us can contribute to a more reliable and trustworthy online environment during crises. So whether it's verifying information, like I do when my mom sends me those WhatsApp messages that go viral, or just maybe educating them that you can actually verify this, or by evaluating, so like publishers evaluating their content, even when they are using these tools, to make sure that it's not perpetrating a lot of misinformation, or builders, maybe those building the app, just making sure there's transparency in what they are building, the kind of data they're using, and the limitations. And the work we're doing, it's a work in progress, but we're going to be having our technical report at some point, hopefully by the end of the year. So you can, it's in collaboration with CUNATO and the Alan Turing Institute. So you can have a look out for our reports. And yeah, thank you so much. That's all.